Have you ever found yourself lodged in a conversation with someone you would consider toxic? I mean, we've all been in conversations like this, whether it be with toxic partners or conflicts that arise between friends or colleagues at work. I mean, if you're human and you've experienced this sort of idiosyncratic mindfuckery that is verbal and emotional altercations with people. And it seems that not only have we experienced this, these are typically situations that burn very vivid memories into the fabric of our emotional well-being. And these emotional burns tend to send this reverberation of unwanted thoughts and beliefs through the core of how we perceive others. And they often impact how we show up in life. It can be difficult to forget heated exchanges because they often happen with those that we trust to some degree. The words that we hear from our partners seem to pass through a gate in our heart that's often shut for everyone except us. I mean, we expect to some degree that they'll hurt us from time to time, and it doesn't seem to be that much of a consequence when the unconscious banter is backed by beautiful affirmations of love and validation. In other words, there seems to be a comfortable balance of contrasting forces happening with our partners. And, that's just life, and it happens. But what happens when we have people in our lives that seem to deliberately tug on the levers of our most sensitive triggers? Well, the most practical thing that we come to terms with eventually is that we can't change these people. No matter how many Instagram quotes we forward them in hopes that they understand how it is that we feel, more often than not, they don't. And seldom do they try. And this is because they aren't typically thinking about you. And while they continue not thinking about you, here we are. Here we are thinking about their words and the cuts they've left on our hearts, even years later. But, why do these words cut in the way that they do? I mean, not even just in relationships, but why is it that we place so much stock in the hurtful words shared by others? It seems that humans have an aversion to disharmony in a lot of ways. And it seems that this aversion seeps to the core of our sense of survival in nature. I mean, we seem to find harmony and connection with others. And this sort of instinctive reaction to disharmony creates a type of noticeable division between us and the world we so deeply want to believe is beautiful and loving. In other words, the polarity of this density pulls us strongly in one of two directions when we typically realistically want to fall somewhere in the middle, beauty and chaos. So when someone says, fuck you, there's an element of their journey that's wrapped in the sort of multitude of your experiences involving derogatory remarks like this. So what is it about a simple fuck you that's so compelling? What is it about the cadence of a toxic stream of thought that triggers us in the way that it does? Well, because we identify negative communication with a sort of personalized storehouse of memories associated with traumatic experiences from either our childhood, our past relationships, or even just affiliations with strangers we encounter off and on throughout our life. So when someone curses at us, it isn't just them cursing at us. It's as if every person you've ever seen verbally abusing you is also there participating in your demise. It seems that this is the circumstances we find ourselves in. And this happens when we identify too strongly with the negative projections of others. Because the ego has this tendency to make us believe things about us that aren't true. But why does this happen? Well, from my perspective, this seems to happen when we pretend to not know ourselves better than we believe others do. And if we fall into these unconscious traps of believing toxic people know more about us than we do, then we'll always risk being thrown around like rag dolls by these types of people. We risk allowing others to define us in the same way that we define derogatory communication as toxic. So what do? The beautiful thing about the spiritual journey is that it helps us awaken from these sort of unconscious patterns we find ourselves in. Imagine waking up from a dream you've been trapped in for the last 30 years and realizing that everything you once thought about yourself wasn't at all true. And the deeper we go into unraveling the false pretense of these illusions, we realize that communication and the human language is largely responsible for why this confusion even exists to begin with. The human language is fucking confusing. And it's surprising that we even attempt to understand what people mean when they beat us over the head with their false projections of us in the world. Maybe our issue is that we place too much importance on words, and we place an even bigger responsibility on words to define a type of spirit inside that can't be accurately defined by words. So as a way for our ego to reject the ineffability of its own system of understanding the world, it instead forms beliefs and opinions about life and others as a way to sort of protect itself. And it does this incidentally while harming others at the same time. Ego has this way of convincing us that our opinions and our beliefs matter more than the opinions and beliefs of others. And so it becomes clear as to where the division arises and where the work really needs to take place within us. Especially when it comes to us and other people. From my perspective, there are two languages that we as humans have the option to speak from in any given moment. And one is created by a sort of ego's attempt to gather a sense of safety and comfort in a largely unpredictable world moderated by change. And the other is a language that can't really be fully understood with words, but felt with things like intuition and heart. And it's a language that, isn't at all concerned with the concept of survival, because it understands the sort of eternal, undying nature of its own existence. And I think that we as humans, we have a choice in any given moment to perceive life through the lens of these two forces, which are fear or love, heart or mind, ego or spirit. Let's maybe put it this way. So our bodies are like radio stations. And these radio stations contain dials that allow us to access certain frequencies, just as we would use a radio to tune into certain stations that we'd like to listen to. And there are two forces within us that can sort of take the wheel in determining which dimension of frequency we want to spend our time in. And the fact that we have this much control over what we subject ourselves to just shows how great of a responsibility we have to make sure that we're tuning into the, frequencies that are best suited for us. But, many of us don't realize that we have this power. We don't realize that we have access to more than one channel within our bodies. And so some people get stuck listening to just one station their whole lives. The only channel that some people are aware exists is this sort of limited channel of understanding life from a superficial, three-dimensional, you versus me type of reality. And if this is the radio station that we want to experience the world from, it's no surprise. It's no surprise that we walk through life feeling afraid and alone and just sort of separated from the world. And we all know that when the ego is afraid, its only recourse usually is to just attack us and other people, because the ego is just always stuck in survival. The ego knows that it's impermanent. It knows that one day it will not be here. And as a way to sort of remain a type of authority over your life, it will do whatever it takes to prevent you from realizing that impermanence. The ego has these really sneaky ways of distracting us from the sort of eternal self that we have inside. It tries to convince us that we are separate from everything else. And it tries to take possession over circumstances and things and people. And it does this more or less as a way to survive. And I think that's its greatest objective, is to survive. And the beliefs that we have and the verbal languages we've created, the governments in which we live, the cultures in which we represent, all of this points to ego's attempt to protect itself from the unknown. Because in the unknown, ego is completely obsolete and irrelevant. So whenever it's approached by something it doesn't know, whenever it's approached by someone that challenges its beliefs, it has this tendency to attack. And we all know what it feels like to be emotionally abused and verbally attacked and undermined by toxic people. The radio station that they're tuned into is always a battleground of individuals and not communities. It's always us and them. It's always we are wrong and they're not. Make no mistake, though. I think we as humans can sometimes fall into these denser realms. What I'm largely speaking to are the people that seem to be permanently stuck in the dimension of polarity thinking, this sort of dimension of ideological warfare, where it's you and me and us and them and my God versus your God. I mean, we've all experienced people like this. And I think once we awaken to this other dimension that exists within us, we realize how exhausting it is to play within the sort of ego realms, even for short periods of time. And I think that this is what awakening is about. It's about becoming aware of when we fall into these sort of unconscious realms and immediately pulling ourselves out of them. And this really can only happen when we realize and understand that there's another frequency or radio station that we can all tune into with much better music and just overall just better vibes. Although I will say, we don't typically come to explore this until we've experienced our share of trauma first. It's like we have to be thrown headfirst into the flames of our own neurosis before we even think about the possibility that there may be another way of doing things. And it's not until we get to see our hearts just shattered on the floor in a million pieces that we even begin the journey in seeking another way of perceiving things. It's surreal how strong the pull of our ego is. Instead of protecting our hearts from breaking, we go to the brink of what we physically and emotionally can handle and, end up inevitably breaking anyways. I mean, considering how often this is the case for people, it seems almost a prerequisite to awakening in a lot of ways, because we'll often not give up control unless a situation outside of our control intervenes. This situation can be death or illness or emotional, physical violence at the hand of someone else. And that's when we break. That's when we break. Then we begin sort of letting go. And I think this is when the seeker is born. From my experience and my experience of others, is the seeker is typically born out of trauma. It's born from a certain feeling of desperation, not knowing how to move forward in life. It's born from this sort of realization that we can no longer hold on to control because we've really lost it. And it's born from the most honest conversations that we have with ourselves and moments that we can just no longer live with the illusion that we've been holding on to. And we can no longer live under the sort of false pretenses of the ego. The ego sold us a sort of false bill of goods, and it just ends up betraying all of us eventually. And I think that this is where freedom is born, this recognition. This is when we begin to sort of approach this spiritual realm within us. When we throw everything we know and understand about ourselves and the world just out the fucking window, and we're willing to just start over. And I think this is where we begin listening. Our entire lives, we've been listening and taking advice from the wrong voices, whether it be our ego or other people. But when we finally let go, we can begin actually listening to our heart. You see, everyone has their ego tuned into a certain dial on their radio. And that dial is a dimension moderated by certain behaviors and actions and words. And true freedom exists in this sort of understanding that our spirit does speak, but not in a language that our ego typically understands. This spiritual dimension exists in a place that isn't moderated by success or money or status. And it isn't moderated by religion or culture or ideology. And it isn't moderated by words or concepts. These things are all abstractions that are created by ego to help sort of distract us from the true beauty that exists within our heart. Enlightenment is less about being somebody and more about the art of just being. It's about allowing the most beautiful aspects of your creative blueprint to sort of permeate every element of your life. And of course, this doesn't mean that we won't fall asleep every now and again. It doesn't mean that we'll become indifferent to the struggles of life. It just means that the blow of these things won't hold us captive in the ways that they used to. Because in the spiritual dimension, we can always find something to learn from, because we know that there isn't anything that happens without Source allowing it to happen. And eventually we realize that it's all God. And these are definitely beautiful things to consider. But the question still sort of remains, which is, how do we deal with toxic people? I remember I went to the Yucatan Peninsula a while back in 2012. And many of the people native to that area were largely responsible for helping our group navigate safely through each city. There were many people there that we would consider to be honest. Just like anything, though, there were also people there that were noticeably dishonest. And I think dishonest in the sense that, they clearly wanted to hustle us out of money. Because in the end, we were just tourists. And, we all know how that goes. And so if you're someone that travels outside of the US, you know that it's common to connect with people who speak a completely different language than you. And in terms of geography, someone in Mexico is tuned into a completely different cultural radio station than someone from California. And so it's no surprise that I found myself in several situations where I had to communicate with others and didn't speak the same language. We've all experienced this before, but if you're paying attention during these types of situations, you can observe something very surreal about these interactions. And that is that words are just a syntax of audible symbols with meaning. And these meanings are pre-designated by certain local communities of people. And even if this is the case, language appears to be largely subjective and always left to interpretation by the one on the other side of the conversation. And despite this, language still appears to be a currency none of us can live without. It's what seems to sort of glue our relationships together. But the surreal thing about this is how the relevance of our language completely disappears the second we enter another country. This becomes really clear in places like Italy or France if you've ever traveled. A part of you once held so dear is reduced down to just audible sound with little context. And this is really interesting because it shows, how quickly ego can just fall apart. It shows how quickly you can disappear. And I think there's a lot of beauty in this understanding because then you realize how impermanent and how ephemeral it all is. You realize how it doesn't really make much sense to grasp at something so strongly because it can so easily be taken away from you in an instant. And all it takes is you just getting on a plane in a different country for your ego to just ghost you and be like, fuck you, I'm out. The reason why I bring this up is when we're in these positions with people that speak a different language, we don't really have room to take offense to what they say because we don't understand the linguistics of what they're trying to communicate. So usually instead, we show reverence and respect to someone of a different culture. And at the very least, we try and understand where they're coming from. And I think in the end, if we end up getting lost in translation, we typically move on and continue enjoying our lives. We don't allow these conversations to linger in our subconscious and permit them to cause us emotional pain for years. We just let them go and we don't look back. So can we begin seeing our connection with toxic people in this way? Can we acknowledge that they're just tuned into a frequency that's comfortable for them? And it may be comfortable for them, but it may be just completely foreign to you, and just allow it to be. Because ultimately ego has a language in which it prefers to communicate, but so does love. And the two don't typically have to connect unless you want them to. So if there's a toxic person in your life that takes every opportunity to try and dim your light, just see it as a language that you don't speak, nor do you want to understand. You can offer them respect, offer them reverence, and just move on. Because love is a language that you'd prefer to speak. And anything less than that is not a path that you're willing to explore or allow into your space, unless you want it in your space. And I should make one thing clear, though. This doesn't at all imply that you should remain indifferent to the suffering of others. If we're experiencing life from this higher dimension of love, we would actually find it really difficult to ignore the shortcomings of others. And if we find ourselves entering into the space of indifference, this often sort of presents itself as a type of spiritual bypass, which consists of even more ego than we were used to having previously been asleep. So if you ever find yourself recycling these sort of socially recognizable phrases like good vibes only, or don't kill my vibe, or demeaning others for having a bad day, then you may find yourself in a much bigger trap than them. And there's nothing really more irresponsible than entering spirituality only to use it as a weapon against someone who hasn't had the opportunity to explore their own awakening yet. So it's important that we always remain compassionate, because the paragon of awakening is that it allows us to see the suffering of others as a sort of mutual and shared journey. because our role in that process is to be present to the chaos of someone else's experience without allowing it to penetrate our peace, without allowing the ego to identify their pain as our own. We can still be compassionate and understand someone else's suffering while still remaining heart-centered in our truth. And, instead of pushing others away for what they feel or what they say, we can allow them the opportunity to awaken in just the same way that we have. So if you experience toxic people, just wish them love, wish them peace. And if they aren't willing to collaborate with you on a solution, then we need to just let them go and move on.